Let's talk about abortion. It's a little awkward as a man to talk about something that is clearly a decision made by largely, for the most part, women, but there's more to this conversation than just the decisions of women. We are thinking now as a culture, as a society, what should we support? What do we think is moral? What should be law? And that includes all genders, even though clearly it's largely a choice made by women. Men should be a part of this, and as I hope you will see, for good reason. The point of today's talk is to give us some basics in the argument, some of the terminology, and to raise a controversial question, I hope, that abortion is not really just a conversation for scientists determining what life is. It's not just something that medical doctors determine. It's certainly not something the laws of the land should determine. I will argue that abortion is a philosophical question about the nature of life. What does it mean to be alive? And when we realize or we frame that question on abortion in terms of what is life, we'll see that it is an interdisciplinary question. We need to bring the sciences, medical, other, everything to bear on this question. What is abortion? The World Health Organization, this is a statistic. We realize, of course, that these things are general, but they estimate somewhere around 73 million induced abortions take place every year. Induced abortion. So we'll get to this terminology in just a second, but if there are 73 million abortions every year, and if you're of the position that abortions are murder is the intentional killing of an innocent person that does not ask for it, the intentional killing of an innocent person that does not ask for it, so it's not euthanasia, it's not suicide, it's murder, then we have a genocide of sorts going on at 73 million a year, if that's your position. Again, the World Health Organization, roughly 6 out of every 10, or 61% of all unintended pregnancies, end in abortion. 6 out of 10 unintended pregnancies end in abortion. So the number there is pretty high. Again, these are squishy. They're not universal. Every country is going to be a little bit different. In Canada, as an example, the numbers here have dropped roughly since 1998, fairly continuous rate. But that's not to say all countries are the same. Let's look at some of the terminology to help us out. Pro-choice and pro-life. I'm sure you've heard these terms before. Why these terms? What is it? What role are these terms playing? And pro-choice, I always thought it was odd. Pro-choice and pro-life. Does that mean that the other side is not pro-choice or pro-life? Aren't we all pro-choice, pro-life? Yes. But we're drawing attention to a conflict of interest here. That's what these terms are doing. So what is pro-choice? Pro-choice believes that a woman has a right to choose her own pregnancy, whether to continue it or not. And possibly, in some cultures, whether or not we think it should be socially funded abortion. So if you are a pro-choice individual, you're saying the woman has a right to choose what happens with her body. If you're a pro-choice person in a larger social context, you're saying, hey, you know what? And this should be sponsored or funded or somehow facilitated by the medical community in which this person lives. Pro-life, believing that a fetus has a right to life, the right to life. So this overrides pro-choice in the sense that choice focuses on the mother's intentionality, the mother's decision-making, whereas life focuses on the fetus. Our job as a society, is to figure out which one do we want to support, because we can't support both equally, unfortunately. Choice does not apply to the fetus for obvious reasons. We have no way of communicating with the fetus. We have no real intelligible information that fetuses can think in that sense of making decisions. So short of having a time machine or some kind of extrasensory perception, choice does not apply to the fetus. And also we simultaneously say that life, the question of life, does not apply to the mother, because as a culture, we already assume that the mother is making this decision and having to have this decision because she's alive. She already has this thing called life, and we're not in a position to take that life away from the mother. She's already considered fully human and fully alive. If the fetus has no choice, which we're assuming is true, and if the fetus has no life, that is, a fetus is not a human being like a mother has life and is a human being, then we can easily arrive at permissible abortion, induced abortion. That's not a problem. No choice, no life, abortion. Okay. But if this fetus thing, this entity or maybe non-entity, if this fetus thing has no choice, again, we're granting it, but it does have life, then we have a problem. If this thing has this designation called life, human life, like the mother does, then we may end up with abortion being legalized murder. That sounds dramatic, but again, murder is defined here as the intentional killing of an innocent person who does not ask for it. So if we legalize abortion, if we agree as a community, pro-choice versus pro-life, and if the fetus does have a life, we have a problem. At this point, we can already clarify the question. The question is not pro-life or pro-choice. The question is largely, what is life? What is that moment, or what is that standard? What is the bar? What is the measure? What is the criteria for being alive? The term abortion is an elective decision to terminate a pregnancy before a fetus is viable. This is one version, this is the dominant version of the term abortion, an elective decision. I'm choosing to do this, or a woman is choosing to do this voluntarily, hopefully not through being forced, to end this pregnancy before this fetus could live on its own outside the mother. Well, how do you know? This becomes another squishy question. How do you know when the fetus is viable outside the mother? And we'll return to this again. That is largely, clearly, a medical scientific question. And that changes all of the time. What was possible a year ago versus, say, 15 years ago, well, fetuses can live now at a very young age with our help. Even small fetuses, the size of your hand, can survive outside the mother with medical intervention. So now we have to decide, do we mean a fetus is a living thing, it's viable with medical intervention once it's born, or without medical intervention? So there are a lot of paths here that we need to follow, but basically we're asking the same question over and over again. When is it life? And in this case, viable, a fetus being viable, is it gets that name, having life, or that criteria of having life, when it can survive outside the mother. Abortion then is intervention in an otherwise natural course of affairs. If you do nothing, this fetus will turn into a human being. If you do something to end the pregnancy, presumably before viability, then of course the pregnancy will be terminated. This is different than miscarriage. A miscarriage is involuntary. The body itself makes this decision, or maybe a traumatic event makes this thing happen where the fetus can't be carried to term. And this too is different than therapeutic abortion. A therapeutic abortion is if the woman's life is in danger, then things need to be done. Extraordinary measures, medical intervention needs to happen to save this woman. And even very strong conservative views hold that because the mother has life and because the mother is a human being, that while the conservative view says we don't like abortion, you shouldn't do that, that if it means saving the mother's life, most seem to err on the side of, well, then it's necessary. Even abortion, for a strong conservative view, a therapeutic abortion, can be medically necessary for some conservatives. Like me, you probably sense the uncomfortableness of this position. Most people don't want to make an either-or decision between life and choice. We want both, unless you're a psychopath. If you don't believe people deserve life or choice, then of course you're in a position of wanting to deny them this. In an ideal world, we want both choice and life. But we have an inherent conflict now between possible persons. Whose choice, whose life, whose rights, and which must society defend? Abortion is a personal question, obviously. But it's also obviously, for practical reasons, institutional reasons, moral reasons, and of course legal reasons, a social question. So as personal as abortion is, it's also social. This for many people is also an uncomfortable point, because if you were living on a deserted island somewhere, you might think differently than your society allows. There are many laws and things that I disagree with in my culture, but I follow them because overall it's in my best interest to follow things that I have some moral conflict with. There are some things, however, that could potentially land me in jail if I was ever forced to do them. Just as an example, let's assume I live in a country with capital punishment where we kill criminals. really bad criminals who've done really bad things, I might have a hard time if I was asked to be the one injecting a criminal with some sort of toxin to kill them. I may end up in moral conflict and having to go to prison because I simply couldn't do that. We all live in cultures that we don't agree with 100%. And the question of abortion is not something that's going to satisfy everybody. Somebody's going to be upset at the end of the day. Abortion is a social question. I realize that it's a very intimate, personal question, but we live in society. We have laws, we have medical institutions that be providing these abortions ostensibly. We have a lot of layers to this. So to say that abortion is just an individual question for each individual woman alone misses the mark. However, the great danger here is that we take away women's rights to make any kind of decisions over their own bodies, and we force institutionally things that are unfair, things that are corrupt or exploitive, and so on. And that's not just with abortion. That could be anything. You might think of legalizing drugs, or you might think of all kinds of laws that prohibit certain actions, both for men or for women. The fact that we have laws in a culture means that we're going to live in a place that we might not fully agree with on all terms. We may not agree with their views of alcohol. We may not agree with, if you're living in a country with capital punishment, we may not agree with a lot of these things. And yet we're forced, unfortunately, the word behave isn't right, but we're forced to be a part of a system that we might not completely agree with. The world's not perfect. No system is perfect. The question is, how do we make it a little more perfect? How do we make it a little bit better? Moral dilemmas or conundrums around abortion ended with this moral tragedy that regardless of what we do, it seems like there's going to be a loss somewhere. We'll get back to that. Because we have a conflict of interest between life and choice, possibly, if the fetus has life, and because we don't live in an ideal world, no one gets to decide completely freely. There are going to be moral restraints, legal restraints, social restraints, and there are going to be contextual restraints. To say that abortion is a one cookie cutter size view that fits everyone in every context is out of touch. For instance, I'm using the word abortion in a generalized sense, but if we were talking about rape or incest, we might want to contextualize that discussion far more. I'm just being general here, but to have a law can be somewhat difficult sometimes because not all laws allow for contextual moral decision making. Let me say that one more time. Not all laws allow for contextual moral decision making. Laws sometimes lag behind moral consensus of a community. Laws are sometimes arbitrary, or in some cases there aren't any laws at all. So we have a conflict at a social level regarding what people think the laws should be, even though they might not exist. In Canada, we live in an illegal state in terms of abortion. We'll go back to that too. To boil it all down, the three conflicts. We have a conflict of choice. We have a conflict of laws that determine action, whether those laws are right or wrong. And we have a conflict over this idea of life. Not just life, but also what measure of a quality life, a good life, should be socially encouraged, defended. This becomes a right to life. A right is anything society defends. So if I have life, how far should society be expected to go to defend my right to life? Obviously, to defend me, my country shouldn't go to war with another country just to defend one person. That doesn't make sense. But what if it was 90% of the people in the population that were being threatened by a hostile invasion force? Well, then yes, we could decide then that society has this obligation to defend my right to life. Abortion obviously isn't that extreme in terms of 90% of a population, but if there are 70-some million abortions a year happening, that's well over twice the size of my country. And some people feel that war is, in terms of violence, whatever extraordinary measures need to be taken to defend that 70-some million number of fetuses being aborted every year. This is a powerful conversation. Bombings at abortion clinics. People have taken up arms in the attempt to defend what they consider to be the innocent. This is not just a simple moral issue of, I like pizza and you like sugar. This is a life and death kind of discussion. The legal status on abortion in Canada. This is the old part of the legal code in Canada, Section 251, which was taken down. Everyone who, with the intent to procure the miscarriage of a female person, whether or not she is pregnant, uses any means for the purpose of carrying out his intention, is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for life. Wow, okay. So don't try to have an induced abortion or things might go very poorly for you. This law was struck down on January 1988 by the Supreme Court based on the arbitrary nature of the law. Why? Because it violated a woman's constitutional right to the security of a person. With the old criminal code, there were therapeutic abortion committees, which were committees of 3 medical doctors who would decide whether an abortion fit an exemption to that criminal code act. So if you wanted to have an abortion, you would go to this therapeutic abortion committee. The 3 doctors would decide, yes, you can have an abortion, or no, you can't. And which sounds fine, right? You just have doctors determine whether this is a healthy, helpful thing. We do that with so many other things in life. But the problem was, across Canada, women didn't have equal access to these therapeutic abortion committees. One living in Toronto, Canada's biggest city, versus one living in Nunavut with very few healthcare practitioners wouldn't have the same access, which means, based on unfairness, that there was a real problem. In its decision, the court stated, quote, "The right to liberty guarantees a degree of personal autonomy over important decisions intimately affecting his or her private life. The decision whether or not to terminate a pregnancy is essentially a moral decision, and in a free and democratic society, the conscience of the individual must be paramount to that of the state." End quote. The conscience of the individual must be paramount to that of the state. This is essentially anti-paternalism, which says the government shouldn't be a parent over your personal healthcare decisions. And that sounds amazing. But in practice, that's very, very difficult. Whether it's the government with socialized medicine, Canada has a system that means universal health care, or maybe if you're in the US and insurance brokers, insurance companies make decisions largely on the quality of care. Depending on the context, everybody's making decisions for your personal health care. So I like this idea that the conscience of the individual should be paramount in all healthcare decisions. But the reality is that doesn't often apply. There are many mitigating forces or decision makers that get in the way of that. Still, for what it is, in Canada, we have no abortion law. So back to our big question, what is life under the criminal code in Canada? When does a person become a person? When does a thing become a person? In Canada, a fetus or a thing becomes or is a child having legal rights or a legal designation. It's a human being when it proceeds from the mother, when it's outside the mother's womb. Section 206 of the Criminal Code. A child becomes a human being within the meaning of this act when it has completely proceeded in a living state from the body of its mother, whether or not A, it has breathed, B, it has an independent circulation, or C, the navel string is severed. Part 2 of that. A person commits homicide when he causes injury to a child before or during its birth, as a result of which the child dies after becoming a human being. Section 206 of the Criminal Act is still in effect. So you are a human being when you emerge into the light of day. If someone gets in the way of that while you're being born, in that immediate context of being born, they're going to be held criminally liable. In other words, Canada gives you rights and will defend your right to life when you're born. Not a week before, a month before, when you're born. Does that then mean that anyone can have an abortion right up to the moment of being born? Well, no. There are different rules in place across the provinces in Canada regarding what term in the pregnancy abortions are permitted. This goes back to medical decisions being made by doctors. We'll get to this in just a moment. What is the difference between being in some cases, 6 months abortion in extraordinary cases, versus 2 months? What is the difference between these two measures of time in terms of personhood? maybe that's the wrong question to be even asking. No doubt you've heard of the famous Roe v. Wade, in which in the US the court affirmed a guaranteed right of personal privacy that limits interference by the state. So the government can't tell you what to do in your own private life. But that's not an unqualified right by each individual. There are important interests that the state wants to be involved in, and so it has regulations or it has laws. In other words, Roe v. Wade recognizes that individual right to choice, but there are other factors that the state should be involved in making decisions. And so they made a big effort to mix these two. The result is that in the first trimester, the woman's right to end her pregnancy cannot be affected or stopped or curtailed in any way by the state. A woman can do what she wants in the first trimester. In the second trimester, the state may get involved. The government, big parent, for some, the overlord, can get involved, but that needs to be balanced again with the woman's right, specifically her right to health. After viability, the government can step in and regulate, even ban abortion when it's necessary, especially to save the woman's life, therapeutic abortion. So we have a gradation now between you have free right to choose as you wish for a certain time period. And then after a certain time period, external forces, the laws, the social morality, or the government in general, steps in and says, whoa, 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 we're not okay with this. Enough is enough. You've reached a cutoff time in which you can exercise free will and your right over your own body, and now you have to let this thing run to full course. Here's some terminology to help us out a bit. At conception, we have a one-celled zygote. Zygote, what a weird term, right? Zygote. Within 24 hours, usually it's 2 cells-ish, and then you have a multi-celled zygote, right? More than one. This thing gets implanted in the uterine wall within the first 2 weeks. Now it's called an embryo. So you have a changing in terminology based on the progression of physical events and time. So zygote to embryo. It remains an embryo until about the 8th week. That's 2 months-ish. During this time, the organs begin to develop. Around this 2-month period, we have brain waves that can be detected. That's right. Within 2 months, you have brain waves. So again, back to the question, what is life? More to the point, what are you? I personally tend to think that I am my thinking, I am my brain, I am my body, obviously. I don't want a weird dichotomy there, but I'm largely my thinking, my brain. So there's evidence of me as early as 2 months thinking. After 5 to 7 months, the fetus is externally viable. So there's a bit of a window there between 5 months and 7 months. After 5 to 7 months, the fetus is externally viable. It might feel that the question of abortion is a moving target based on new technologies and when something can survive viability outside of the womb. That's because it is. There are two extremes in this conversation, the conservative side and the liberal side in their extreme manifestations. Obviously, there's a broad spectrum in between, and you may share a little bit of both from either extreme, but here they are to help us out. On the conservative, strict conservative side, abortion should never happen. The one exception, of course, therapeutic abortion to save the mother's life, but it should not happen. It's not something that is a general practice we should legalize. Pro-choice is something that is inherently contradictory and immoral. Just focusing on choice and not life, bad decision. The entity is a human being. Whatever this thing is, call it a zygote, embryo, fetus, it's a human being with moral worth. It's a human being with moral worth, whatever this moral worth thing is, from the moment of conception. And there is a continuum all the way through. So there isn't an abrupt line where month 4 or week 3 or whatever. There's no abrupt line where we can just say, oh, switch, now it's a human being. Not even being born does this thing suddenly get mysterious rights bequeathed by society. This thing has always had rights. It's always been human since the beginning. So, path in the road, impregnate, this thing is a human being, regardless of whether someone makes the decision to have an abortion or whether someone decides to continue on with the natural process and allow this thing to be born. There's no cutoff period. On the liberal side, abortion can be done for any reason. And that may sound flippant, but the idea is here to be logically consistent. You can't just say abortion sometimes. You can't just say abortion in the case of incest. You can't just say abortion when it's convenient. If the woman has the right to choose, a woman has a right to choose to determine her own body as best as any of us can in a society that still conditions us and rules over us to have certain laws we have to follow, then she always has that decision. And government shouldn't be in a position to say, hey, we're going to take that right away when we want to. So, abortion at any time for any reason. Would people tend to socially shun somebody who intentionally gets pregnant and then intentionally has an abortion to get people's attention, to be dramatic, or maybe they're on a reality TV show and they decide to do something dramatic like that? Yeah, people would probably be upset, but the position would be still logically sound to say, for any reason, it's her body, she can do what she wants. Just like I could get a tattoo covering my whole face. It might not be the best decision for me, but it's my face. I can do what I want. The entity may or may not be human. From a liberal perspective, this thing may or may not be human, but we don't have to call it a person. Why would we have to give it moral standing or moral worth? It has human DNA, sure. It has the physical makeup of a human being, sure. But why does that necessitate giving it moral rights? Why must we defend its right, especially if that right is in conflict with woman's choice? Sure, we're talking about the woman's choice, we're not talking about the woman's life, but we have a conflict of rights here. There's no continuum for the liberal, just born or unborn. For the liberal, once this thing becomes a child, once it's born, then the full rights kick in, full personhood kicks in. To answer the question, what is life? For the conservative, from the moment a zygote, from the moment there's a zygote, there's human life with human worth with moral rights that should be defended. What then on to implantation, then the embryo, then this thing called the quickening, where the female can actually feel the fetal movement, and of course, viability. For the liberal, born. Right? Zygote, born. That's a pretty big difference there. But how do we know? How do we know what life is? And if the liberal can not discount, but overlook having human DNA, having brainwaves, even having a heartbeat, and say life begins when something is born, or in some cases when it's simply viable, that seems to be the dominant view when it's viable. The conservative says even before there's a heartbeat, even before there are brainwaves, as a zygote. This is a philosophical question. The science describes these things. Science, medical science is a descriptive act. This is what is the case, and we can see this, and we can register brainwaves. And this is the process that doesn't tell us reasonably how we should interpret the question, what is life? And so abortion is very hard to solve for so many. Where do you draw that line? For the conservative, abortion is murder. Murder is wrong, as the intentional killing of someone who doesn't ask for it. The fetus has rights. All humans, whether potential or actual, have rights. So human as a zygote, which is a potential more human like me, has the same rights as I do. The problem here is that if we say it doesn't, we end up systematically discriminating against a specific group of people or things, in this case, based on age, being preborn, that group of embryos, fetus, zygotes, we want them to not have rights. We want them to be treated differently than people of our standing. We're discriminating against them because they're the same as us. They are the same as us, just on a different developmental stage. So to say it's okay to do away with them is systematic discrimination against the most vulnerable segment of humans. So not just poor humans, which are vulnerable, not just humans with disabilities, which are vulnerable, but those who can't even make decisions for themselves at all, that aren't even really conscious yet. This is for the conservatives, a very brutal form of discrimination. There is also the slippery slope argument. Abortion diminishes respect for human life. So goes the argument, in that it opens the door to killing others. All right, so we say those who are very young aren't really humans, so we can get away with abortion. But what about the very old? The very old start to lose their faculties. The very old start to kind of be like children in a way. They become immobile at a certain stage. Maybe we can treat them differently. They've progressed from the womb in a living state. So technically, in Canada, they have rights. But when they're virtual vegetables, they still have brain waves like an embryo might. They still have, but so that's one of the arguments. I don't find that terribly persuasive myself, but it raises the larger question: can we relevantly distinguish between fetuses and children? It seems easier to distinguish between fetuses and the really radically old, but can we? Another argument from the conservative is to apply the golden rule. The golden rule is this: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So treat others the way you want to be treated. Do you like living? Do you appreciate life? If so, it is contradictory to take that away from a fetus. You like being alive. You enjoy watching videos like this. You enjoy thinking. It is inherently contradictory to then say, well, this organism, this zygote, will, if we don't do anything about it, will be born and it will be able to do the things I do. And I like doing the things I do, but I'm going to deny this thing, even if you don't think it's human, I'm going to deny this thing that right. That's a hard pill to swallow. But notice there's a bit of a conflict here. If I say, I enjoy life, I enjoy being able to make decisions, therefore the child should be, this, I'm assuming it's a child, should be able to survive so that it can have life and make decisions, we're taking away that decision from the mother. So we're taking away something from the mother that we want to give to this child. Long term, obviously, we're hoping this child will live for years and years and years. So in giving life, or allowing life, or encouraging life in the child, we are taking away choice, which according to the golden rule isn't ideal, but which is better, to be alive and have fewer choices, or not to be alive at all? Again, we're processing this through the argument that I want other people to have what I like, and I like having some choice rather than none. Some choice rather than none. Sacrifice is something that is, we all have to sacrifice. We wish society could be successful without sacrifice, that we would all get everything we want all of the time. Sacrifice is a weird word. I don't know that we really use it much in culture, but it's this idea of giving up some things, negotiating, like a business deal, negotiating with others, so that I get other things that I prize more. So I have to pay taxes into the government, even though I like money. So I don't give taxes. They take the taxes whether I want to or not, but I give taxes, but then I also get healthcare, or I get roads, or I get schooling for my children. So it all works around, even though it's not a perfect system. I don't want to do some of these things. I have responsibilities, in other words. So the golden rule acknowledges that we have responsibilities, that we're going to have to sacrifice some things, but the main point of it is that we get what we like in life by encouraging it and giving access to it in other people. If that makes sense. The liberal response is that a fetus does not have full moral status. It is only a potential person. It's not an actual person, it's a potential person. Ending a pregnancy with a potential person is not ending the pregnancy of an actual person. A fetus is not an innocent person because it's not a person. In fact, some of the literature, you'll have this idea of it being an unwelcome stranger, maybe even like a cancerous growth. There's just something inside a woman's body. She doesn't want it there. That she didn't invite it in. She didn't make that decision, I want to have a baby. It's there. And to say that it's an innocent person that society requires that she brings to term doesn't work for the liberal. It's important to point out that for many liberals, the intent is not to kill the fetus. Intent. That thinking. We're not targeting, systematically discriminating against a group, an entity. We are simply taking the mother's rights of self-ownership over her own body and letting her exercise those rights. And her right to autonomy means severing this fetus thing from inside of her. It's not the systematic discrimination against a group. It's systematic freeing of, or liberating a woman's choice to give it actual manifestation, or that is to allow her decisions to be practically applied. The liberal response to the slippery slope argument is to say that it's only suggested at best. Declaring that abortion is a slippery slope is actually a fallacy unless we can show that there are very clear reasons why allowing abortion will then lead to disrespect for other humans, the elderly specifically. You need to be able to show, okay, we have these laws in Canada, then we get rid of these laws, and now anybody can have an abortion. Has that had an impact on the elderly? Are we suddenly, are we euthanizing the elderly because it's inconvenient? That doesn't seem to be the case at all. So you need to show a slippery slope. Simply saying something is without evidence for it is a fallacy. For the liberal position, if you forbid abortion, you're diminishing the status of women. It's pretty simple. If you take away someone's right over their own body, the decision to operate their body however they want, their choice-making opportunities are diminished. Their human status in some way is diminished. Are we not a product of our own choices? Whether our character decisions or our practical applied lives, how we make these decisions, are we not these things? And if we are these things and a government comes in and says, you can't do this, recall that we've already discussed how the government tells us what we can and can't do in many areas of our lives. The question isn't whether the government controls us, whether laws have an impact on how we might make decisions, but to what degree do those control factors, these limiting factors, take away our humanity? That's the problem. And the argument here is that for women, on the question of abortion, it's one of those questions that it's not like saying, I can't, for example, I can't import coral. I have an aquarium, I want to import coral. I can't import coral from another country. That's a law. It may seem silly in some ways because I want to grow this coral and make more coral. I don't want to harm the reefs or anything. Aquaculture coral, not from the reefs. I can't do that. So that doesn't really make me less human, that the government won't let me import coral, even though it's been grown in tanks. But if the government won't let me eat food, well, then that's a real problem because I'm going to die very soon. It's a very different level now of decisions being controlled by the government. And for some, abortion is one of them that very much limits a woman's humanness. For the conservative, no, 9 months of bringing this thing to term and then giving it up for adoption or keeping it if you so decide at the end, that doesn't limit your humanity at all. That's a very small sacrifice in the grand scheme of things for the conservative. But for the liberal, the damage has already been done. She's been made less human by allowing or taking her choice away. Let's talk about the doctrine of double effect. Double effect. The doctrine says that the criteria by which an action, any action like abortion, can be justified has something to do with our motives. So something is okay or not. Something is okay when our motives are okay. So the doctrine of double effect basically has 3 requirements. The action is itself good or at least neutral. If the action is bad, however we define bad, murder as an example, the intentional killing of an innocent person for fun or entertainment, that's not neutral. That's obviously bad. 2, the actor must intend good. So your actions need to be at least neutral, if not good, and you need to intend for something to be good. The actor is justified if and only if the good effect outweighs the bad effect. We want more good. We're not really clear what good is yet, but we want more good than bad. So far, this sounds okay. Think about this example. A doctor who opposes abortion, just completely, no, I don't like it, abortion is always wrong. But this doctor is working with a woman and he needs to remove her cancer-ridden reproductive organs. She's in a bad way. But by doing so, to save this woman, the fetus is going to die. So the doctor doesn't want this fetus. He has no intention of harming this fetus. But if he doesn't perform this removal of these cancer-ridden organs, the woman will definitely die. Has he wronged? Has he done something wrong? Well, according to the doctrine of double effect, the action is neutral or good, right? He must intend neutral or good, and the overall effect must be good. And the answer would be no. Even though his own moral standing says abortion is wrong, In this case, which is not something most of us would experience, right? This was an extraordinary case. He hasn't done any wrong. He's done something good. Even though if he believes this fetus has a right to life, the liberal position makes use of this in making the following argument. People are not responsible for unintended or indirect effects. You can't hold me responsible for something that I didn't want to have happen when I did something good or neutral, and this other thing happens. That's not my fault. And because technically an abortion is disconnecting a fetus from the mother, severing that cord between the mother and the fetus, you didn't put a fetus, you didn't inject the fetus with some chemical to kill it. You didn't electrocute the fetus. You simply severed the connection between the two. The unintended or indirect effect of that is not my responsibility or your responsibility. Abortion, in other words, it meets the criteria of the doctrine of double effect. At this point, the conservative steps up and goes, wait a minute. How in the world are we making a reliable distinction between direct and indirect consequences or causes? How are we making that? Is it morally significant to make a difference between killing a baby and letting it die? I'll say it again. Is it morally significant to make a difference, a very important difference or distinction between killing a baby and letting it die? Every person who's performing an abortion knows the direct outcome, the direct effect. This cause has that effect. Intention absolutely matters. What you intend and what you want. But just because you're an adult intending something doesn't make it right. Just because I'm a bank robber and I'm an adult and I intend to rob a bank doesn't make it right. That's a bad example, obviously, in this context. But you get this idea. For the conservative, making that distinction doesn't fly. It's splitting hairs that really can't be applied in any real, tangible way. Let's step back again and ask sort of a basic question. What are human rights? Human rights are justified claims to our most vital needs, our vital needs. So I don't have a vital need to have pizza delivered to my home every day, but I do have a vital need to shelter, vital needs. And so that's what makes them justified, that they're vital. As we've already discussed, the government, laws, even social morality makes claims on us that we might not like on a regular basis. And so we must ask, in this context, in this situation, are my vital rights, my vital needs, my human rights being violated? The conservative answer is that we all have a right to life. This is basic right to life. We need to protect that vital need to life. The liberal position is that we have a right to life as a human being. Once you're a human being and you've been born, then we will protect that right. Until then, we protect the mother's right to choose. From the liberal perspective, even if the fetus has some kind of claims or some kind of rights, the rights or claims that it makes on the mother are excessive. You follow that? So even if we agree as liberals that the fetus does have some, okay, maybe potential human being, it has some, we should take care of it more than we would take care of a rock in the field. Okay, fine. But that claim to life outweighs, there's excessive to the mother's claim to make a decision. The conservative response is 9 months really excessive? Just assume 9 months, assume that it's a healthy pregnancy, that there's no long-term damage, and these are a lot of assumptions, right? This might not be the case, but assume for a moment that this child is adopted out shortly thereafter. There are many people who want to adopt children. We could have conversations about overpopulation. We could bring that into, but for the most part, industrialized nations, there's adoption. These child's not typically going to be sent to just a terrible life of poverty or something like that. Again, that's not universal. There are many countries in the world where that would be the case, and we would want to contextualize this conversation. And some people will say, well, what about the cost? And the conservative would respond, yes, it can be costly. In many industrialized nations, of course, the $1 trillion that we spend on a military, we could use some of that to protect human beings. So money might not be as big a deal as we think. Convenience, yeah, convenience would be a problem. Social stigma. In some cases, family shunning. If a woman has a child out of wedlock, it could be social shunning. There are a lot of costs that could be incurred from this. And the conservative response is all of these potential costs, which are very real and can't just be dismissed out of hand, do not outweigh the right to life, the importance of life. And that if you were faced with all of these different things and having to choose whether I want to live, even though living means it's going to be costly for me, there's going to be social stigma for me as a human being, there are going to be these difficulties, would you not still choose life? And if you would still choose life, then it's contradictory to say we take that away from a fetus. So when can one have abortion on demand, if at all? For the liberal, whenever it's in the best interest of the mother, whether that's the mother's career or maybe she has a family with 12 children already that are they're in impoverished condition. Maybe that's enough to justify it for her. Maybe when it's in the best interest of society, we don't want all of these children being excess welfare burdens. These are, of course, financial costs, and I mean, there are many other reasons for why. For the conservative, none of these merit consideration as much as the right to life. My own position on this topic has oscillated over the years because these are difficult topics. This is a very difficult, very philosophical question. What is life and what matters? How do we weigh value? And what do we value? In the liberal position, the woman's right to maybe career, I know that sounds trite, but anything that the woman might be interested in is enough to outweigh keeping this fetus, this thing. More personally, if the woman had 12 children already, they lived in a poor nation, there was no possible way for either adoption or government support, then you're like, okay, well, does that still guarantee that this potential human being, from a liberal perspective, potential human being doesn't deserve a shot at life? It's very tricky. Again, it's contextual. So many of these depend on the circumstances. For the conservative, why? How is that contextual? Because none of these values, none of these interests outweigh life. Career doesn't outweigh a right to life. Again, potential right, depending on position you have. But career, abortion versus adoption, always choose adoption, and so on and so on. And in the interest of society, the liberals will say society doesn't want the extra welfare burden of unwanted children. The conservatives' response, what do you mean? We want more people. We need more people as a society. That is what society is. We need more people. I'm biased. In Canada, we don't have enough people. We have a lot of land, but not enough people. But in some countries, too many people, not enough land. One of the more persuasive arguments, I think, from the liberal perspective is the non-paternalism argument. The non-paternalism. We don't want people taking away our rights, any of our rights to choose to be human. Again, I argue that to be human is largely to choose. So if I can't choose, I can't be human to the full extent. Yes, there are mitigating circumstances. We can't just choose whatever we want, whenever we want. But abortion might be one of those where we can choose, and it is important, and the government shouldn't be involved. Okay, for the conservative, though, that doesn't apply. Why? Because just because you're an adult, just because you say it's my choice, doesn't make it the best choice. Just because you're an adult and it's your choice doesn't make it the best choice, especially when others are involved. If it was just you on your own, fine, you can make your own choice. We're not going to tell you what to do. But there's another person involved, another human being involved. And so we need to get involved, according to the conservative. One of the other issues is chauvinism and gender bias. Often critics of abortion are men. Do men really have the experiential grounds or the experiential basis to have a stake in this conversation? Do men really have the right to tell women what to do with their bodies? This is problematic. But we should note that just because you're a woman does not, again, mean your choices are automatically the best or the healthiest. Many women make bad choices, and many women are, in fact, critics of abortion. So we would be wise maybe not to draw a sharp distinction between gender roles as a contributor to the worth of an argument. This, for conservatives, is deflecting from the real issue, which is the substance or the worth of the argument. And the liberals would say, well, not all liberals, but some liberals would say, no, this is actually a problem, a persistent problem, that people are getting involved in this and they're not necessarily using really strong reasons for it. And they're often men who really don't understand what it means to be a woman and to have your rights taken away from you, the right to choice in this case. So, where does this get us? All sides tend to agree and accept that murder is wrong. Murder is a bad deal. They all accept that people have a right to life and that personal freedom, having the autonomy, the ability to make choices and to exercise those choices, to apply those choices to the real world, those should not be curtailed or limited except in very important circumstances. So don't take away my right to life. Don't be a parent over me unless it is absolutely imperative. What do we do with all that? Well, because we can't decide, maybe we should just let the doctors figure it out. Maybe we should just let the scientists tell us this is what life is. Or maybe not. Is there a middle road that we might be able to find between these two extremes? Is there some sort of mitigating argument that might get a little bit of both sides? Unfortunately, it does seem to be a bit of an either or an or. You really can't have both. We have a very clear conflict now between the rights and the decision making of the mother and that of the potential human being. Abortion draws attention to what's called a moral tragedy. A moral tragedy is the judgment that no matter where we stand, regardless of which argument we think is most persuasive, there's some kind of wrong. Whether you're on the liberal side or the conservative side, either of these spectrums, even the attempt to carve a middle ground must fail in some way, in some part, to create a perfect harmony between these competing interests. We have a moral tragedy. Moral tragedy does not mean that the issue is simply beyond resolution, that there's no end point. It means rather that whatever resolution we pick as a culture, as individuals, will have a cost. It's going to have a cost. Someone is going to lose out. Someone will have to give up some of his or her or its rights to some degree. It's not really a win-win situation. The bite of moral tragedy is that it reminds us that if we think we can have our cake and eat it too, we will probably be unsuccessful. To solve the problem, we need to be prepared to accept compromise and some sort of tragedy. And we need to think philosophically about the very nature of life itself and when we think it begins. For that, I do not have a definitive answer.